Some cases come to a close. This one never did, not in the way such things are meant to finish. Down in the Louisiana Bayou, south of the Atchafalaya, the water splits into channels that refuse to stay fixed. A man can push a skiff down a route he has traveled since childhood and emerge somewhere the maps have never named. That is the kind of country where this story lives. Before we step into it, pull in close. I want to know where you are tonight. Drop a word in the comments, a town, a country, a porch light, anything that fits. I read everyone. It steadies me to know someone is out there in the dark alongside me. Now then, before we begin, a word of note. If the kind of case I tell here is something you would like more of, not just one, but 10 each recounted in full, in a voice meant for the dark, there is a collection. What the Mountain Keeps, 10 files from 10 counties, 5 states, spanning 1893 to 1955. Every one of them walked into ground that looked easy, and every one was closed by the law with the wrong word. 10 hours to sit with in the dark, from opening to end. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Now, Blackrush does not appear on any modern map. It never truly did. It was a strip of raised ground, roughly 6 miles south of a river town called Little Cayenne, Louisiana. In 1912, about 15 families lived out there. Most were trappers. 1 or 2 ran a cypress mill when the water dropped low enough to work the saws. Everything around them was swamp, real swamp, not the kind from picture books, with lily pads and docks and boys fishing off the ends, the other kind. The kind where trees stand in black water past your knees, where moss hangs so thick you cannot see the sky for whole stretches of afternoon, and your own voice travels into the trees and never returns to you. If you have ever stood in a place that swallows sound like that, you know exactly the feeling I mean. Blackrush had that constantly. The trappers used to say the swamp did not want to be spoken to, so they spoke little when they worked. They labored in silence, ate their lunch in silence, and pulled home in silence. If you asked one of them why, most would just shake their heads and buy you a drink to change the subject. A few would answer. Those who did would look you square in the eye and mention the West Run. It was always the West Run, never the East, never the South channels, never the mill ponds. The West Run was where the water turned strange, and everyone knew it and worked around it the way a man works around a bad tooth. You do not touch it if you can avoid it. And in the autumn of 1912, when the disappearances began, most of them stopped speaking altogether about anything related to the water. The man eventually sent in was named Ansel Trebeck. He was 44, an insurance adjuster out of New Orleans. Tall and thin through the shoulders, with a face grown quiet from 2 decades of listening to people lie about barn fires. His hands were those of a paper pusher, long-fingered, careful, ink-stained at the knuckles. He wore a gray suit and a stiff collar, even when the heat should have driven any reasonable man to loosen something at the throat. Ansel Trebeck was not reasonable about his collar. He was reasonable about very little except the ledger. He had been dispatched to Blackrush because a trapper named Oz's Doubtfire had vanished 2 weeks earlier, and Oz's Doubtfire had held a small life policy with Trebeck's firm. The widow was asking to be paid. The firm did not like paying out on a body they had not seen. They liked seeing bodies. That was what they had sent him to find. He met the constable in a wood frame office that smelled of coffee and river mud. The constable's name was Renard Boaz. 49 years old, broad through the chest, with a heavy dark mustache going gray at the ends and eyes that had seen enough that he did not spend them cheaply. Boaz did not rise when Ansel entered. He waved a hand at the chair across the desk and said, "So you are the one they sent about Ozas?" Ansel said he was. Boaz looked at him a long moment. Then he said, "Well, you will not find him." And when Ansel opened his mouth to respond, the constable held up one thick finger and said, "And if you go where he went to not be found, we will not find you either. So stay close to the road, Mr. Trebeck." Ansel said something about being obligated to at least attempt a search. Boaz shrugged. "Suit yourself, but do not go past the last stilt house on the West Run. That one belongs to Margaret Hollow." And Ansel Trebeck asked the question everyone before him had asked. "Who is Margaret Hollow?" The constable took a long time answering that. He turned a coffee cup in his hands, he looked at the wall, he looked at the ceiling, he set the cup down. Then he said, Margaret Hollow is an old woman who lives about 2 miles into the West Run, in a house on stilts her father built before the war. She is somewhere on the near side of 70. She sells herbs. She sells salves. She sells a kind of paste for pulling infection out of a wound that will do it in a night when a doctor would take a week. She has done that for most of the people in Little Cayenne at one time or another. And there are 5 or 6 of us in this town, myself included, who would be dead without her. And she is also, Mr. Trebeck, the reason grown men in this parish will not go west of the third bend after sundown. When Ansel asked why, Boaz was quiet a moment. Then he said, because things go quiet around her, because animals will not cross her yard, because in 1889 a preacher from Baton Rouge came down here to run her off, and the swamp gave him back 3 days later, without his shoes and without most of his mind. And the constable said, Mr. Trebeck, I have known that woman 30 years. She has never done a thing to me, but I do not go west of the third bend either. That is what she is. That night Ansel Trebeck took a room at the boarding house and wrote in his notebook for 2 hours by the light of an oil lamp turned low. He recorded the constable's exact words. He wrote down the names of the missing. Ozas Doubtfire, 41, trapper, vanished in early October. A Pullman named Delphine Voro, 52, vanished the same month. A cypress cutter named Reno Sykes, 36, gone the last week of the same month. 3 men in 3 weeks. All of them experienced on the water, all of them familiar with the West Run. None of them found, not their skiffs, not their tools, not so much as a coat. Ansel wrote in the margin the word pattern, then he underlined it. Then he wrote a second word below it, Margaret. He did not underline that one. He was not the kind of man to underline a name before he had reason to. He put the notebook down. He turned the wick lower and sat for a while in the dark, listening to the swamp breathe against the boarding house wall, the way a lung breathes against a rib. In the morning he hired a skiff and a boy of about 20 to pull him. The boy's name was Cyprian Rowe. Cyprian did not want to go, but Ansel Trebeck paid him $9, which was more money than Cyprian Rowe had ever held in his hand at one time. So they went. The water in the West Run was black, not brown, not tea-colored. Black the way a thing is black when the light does not want to touch it. The cypress knees came up out of it like the knuckles of something buried. And there was no bird song. Cyprian noticed that first and pointed it out. He said, Mr. Listen, there should be birds. Ansel listened. There were no birds. There was the small liquid sound of the pole in the water. There was the creak of the skiff. There was once, from very far off, a single low note that could have been a bullfrog, or could have been something a bullfrog would want to hide from, and then nothing for a long time. Cyprian pulled slower after that. Ansel did not tell him to speed up. Around noon, in a slack channel where the current ran soft, they found Ozas Doubtfire's skiff. It was tied. That was what stopped Ansel. It was tied by a proper trapper's hitch to the root of a bald cypress. And inside it were Ozas Doubtfire's pole and Ozas Doubtfire's tin lunch pail with the lid still on, and Ozas Doubtfire's coat folded neatly on the seat, with the buttons all done up. A man who is going to be gone a while does not fold his coat like that. A man who is going to be gone a while wears it. Ansel looked at the coat for a long time. Then he opened the lunch pail. Inside was bread that had gone black with a hard green ring around it, an apple that had shrunk to the size of a walnut and gone the color of wet leather, and a folded square of paper. The paper had one sentence on it, in a workman's careful hand. It said, I heard her calling me, that was all. No signature, no date, and the paper was dry. In a swamp, on a rotting skiff, in an unsealed pail after 2 weeks, it was dry. Ansel took the paper. He left the pail and the coat. Cyprian did not say a word the whole pole back. When they reached the landing at Little Cayenne, the boy would not take his second payment. He handed the $4 back and said, Mister, I am done. I will not go west again. And then he said something Ansel wrote down that night because the phrasing was strange. He said, You should not have opened that pail. Ansel asked why. Cyprian said, Because now she knows you found it. Ansel asked who she was. Cyprian did not answer. He tied the skiff and walked off up the road and did not look back. Ansel Trebeck stood on the landing a long minute, the folded paper in his coat pocket. It felt heavier than paper ought to feel. He told himself that was foolishness. He told himself he was a man who worked in ledgers and had no business getting spooked by a boy who had grown up on ghost stories. He told himself all of that on the walk back to the boarding house. He did not sleep much that night. He lay on the narrow horsehair mattress with his boots off and his coat hung over the chair by the door, and he listened to the boarding house settle around him. Somewhere on the ground floor a clock was ticking. Somewhere in the yard a dog was barking at something that was not there. And underneath all of it, if he held very still and thought about nothing, he could almost hear the swamp, not the frogs, not the crickets. Something under the frogs and the crickets. A slow, soft pull, like breath drawn through cloth. He told himself he was tired. He told himself the mind of a tired man will invent things. He turned onto his side. He faced the wall and did not sleep, but he did not turn the lamp back on either, because he was not yet ready to admit that he wanted to. He rose before dawn and stood on the small porch of the boarding house with a cup of chicory coffee that had been sitting on the stove all night. The town below was gray. The river was gray. The moss on the trees at the edge of town was gray. The whole world had gone one flat color that had no name. He thought about writing the firm and asking to be pulled off the case. He thought about it for the length of the coffee. And then he threw the last of the coffee off the porch and went back inside and put on his gray suit, because he was Ansel Trebeck, and he had never once in 20 years walked away from a policy he had been sent to close. The next day he did what he was good at. He went to the parish courthouse in Little Cayenne and asked for the register. The clerk was a small dry man named Perkle Kane, who wore spectacles thick enough to bend the light. Perkle did not want to give him the register. Perkle wanted a signed request from the firm on letterhead, and he wanted it in triplicate, and he wanted a small courtesy fee for the trouble. Ansel Trebeck had spent 20 years handling men like Perkle Kane. He paid the small courtesy fee. He got the register and sat in the back of the courthouse for 6 hours reading it. What he found was this. Margaret Hollow had been born in 1843 to a woman named Hollow and a man whose name the register did not bother to write. The father had built the stilt house on the West Run in 1852 and had drowned in 1858 in circumstances the register described only as at night, alone in the water off his own dock. The mother had lived on in that house with her daughter until 1869, when she had walked into the swamp on a Sunday morning without a coat or a hat or a word to anyone, and had not walked back out. The daughter, then 26, had continued to live in the house alone. From 1869 to the present year of 1912 was 43 years alone in a house on stilts in a Louisiana swamp. Ansel Trebeck sat back and thought about that number. 43 years. He tried to picture the woman it would make. He could not. The register went on. In 1871, a suit had been brought against Margaret Hollow by a farmer named August Mariel, who claimed she had cursed his cows to give bitter milk. The suit was dismissed. In 1879, a suit had been brought against her by a preacher named Isaac Vane, who claimed she was a witch and required her removal from the parish. The suit was dismissed. In the margin, someone had written in pencil, Preacher Vane returned to Baton Rouge in poor health, ministered no more. In 1889, a formal complaint had been filed by a man named Bayou, who claimed she had killed his brother by looking at him across a fence. The complaint was withdrawn 11 days later by Bayou himself in writing, and the letter of withdrawal was pasted into the register. The letter said only, "I was mistaken. Please strike my complaint. I am leaving the parish." The register got thinner after that. Fewer people wanted their names near Margaret Hollow's. Pages had been torn out in places, and there were entries in the ledger that referred to preceding entries on pages that no longer existed. Someone had gone through the register at some point in the 1890s and removed the record of something. The clerk, Perkle Kane, when Ansel asked about the missing pages, only shook his head and said, "That was before my time here, Mr. Trebeck. Ask a man older than I am." And when Ansel asked if there was such a man in Little Cayenne, Perkle Kane said, "There is not." That was the whole answer. And the way the clerk said it made Ansel Trebeck not want to ask a second question. But Ansel Trebeck, sitting in the back of that courthouse with the dust motes hanging in the afternoon light, noticed something the register was doing that was not obvious at first. Every 8 or 9 years, going back as far as the register kept the pattern, there was a small cluster of unresolved disappearances on the West Run. 2 men in 1870, 3 in 1879, 2 in 1888, 3 in 1897, 2 in 1905, and now in 1912, 3. He counted them again. He turned the pages back and counted them a third time to be sure. He was sure. The clerk, Perkel, watched him from behind the spectacles the whole time, and when Ansel finally closed the register, the clerk said, "Mr. Trebeck, if I might." Ansel looked up. The clerk said, "Whatever it is you think you have found in there, it will not help you. Men have found it before. It has never helped any of them." And Ansel Trebeck, who was a reasonable man, said the reasonable thing, which was, "Thank you for the register." But he sat there another quarter hour after the clerk had gone back to his desk because he could not quite make himself stand up. And here, a breath before what comes next. If this is the kind of case you would want to sit with in the dark, not just hear at once, but keep it. There is a collection I put together with the people at Forbidden Unresolved Stories. What the Mountain Keeps. 10 complete cases, 8 hours. 62 years of records nobody wanted to finish. Each one placed, dated, and signed off with a tidy word that never once fit what happened. The link is in the description below and at the top of the comments. And while you go find it, do me a second favor. In the comments tell me, have you ever known a place that felt older than it should? A stretch of road, a stand of trees, a house on a hill, a room in an old building somewhere. Somewhere the air did not want you there. I want to hear about them. I read everyone. Now back to Ansel Trebeck. Back to Blackrush, back to the West Run and the Third Bend, and the woman none of them had been able to look at straight for 43 years. He hired a different boy. This time Cyprian Rowe would not come back and had told everyone in Little Cayenne not to go with the man in the gray suit, and word travels fast in a town of 200. So Ansel Trebeck pulled himself. He was not much good at it. It took him most of a morning to get to the Third Bend, and another hour passed that to see the roofline of the stilt house through the moss. He tied his skiff. He looked at the house from the water for a full minute before he moved. It was smaller than he had pictured. Cypress boards silvered by decades of weather, a tin roof pitted with rust, the pilings under it slick with something dark that was not quite algae. No porch, just a plain door at the top of a plain ladder, and one window on each visible wall, and no smoke from the tin flue on the roof even though the morning was cool. Nothing in the yard, no garden, no chickens, no boat but his own tied at the piling. And around the whole thing, a stillness so complete he could hear the fibers of the rope creaking as his skiff drifted against the piling. He climbed the ladder. He knocked because he was the kind of man who knocked, and the door opened. Margaret Hollow was smaller than he had pictured her, not much over 5 feet, and thin the way a person gets thin from a long life of only eating exactly what is required. Her hair was completely white and worn in a loose braid down her back. Her hands were brown and knotted at every knuckle from what must have been a lifetime of pulling roots out of black ground. Her eyes were a very pale gray, almost the color of water in a tin cup. And Ansel Trebeck realized as she looked at him that he did not want to keep looking back, but he did. She said, "Come in, Mr. Trebeck. I have been expecting you for 2 days." The house was one long room. Dried herbs hung from every rafter, bundles tied with seine string. A cast iron stove burned low against the far wall. A rocker sat by the front window with a shawl folded over the arm. There was a narrow bed in the corner made up with a gray quilt. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf of glass jars whose contents Ansel could not identify and did not want to. Everything was clean. That struck him. In a house 43 years alone in a swamp, he had expected disorder. He found instead a room that had been kept by a person who had nothing to do but keep it. She sat him at the table. She put a tin cup of dark tea in front of him. He did not drink it. She noticed and did not remark on it. She sat across from him and folded her brown knotted hands and waited. Ansel Trebeck was a man who ran interviews for a living. He knew how to make a silence work for him. He tried to make this silence work for him. He could not after a full minute. He said, "Mrs. Hollow." And she smiled a very small smile and said, "Miss," he said, "Miss Hollow, 3 men have gone missing on the West Run in the last month. The constable tells me nobody will look past the Third Bend on account of you. I am here from the firm about Oz's dote fire. I found his skiff yesterday. I found a note in the pail." She let him finish when she said, "And what did the note say?" He took the paper from his coat and put it on the table between them. She did not touch it. She read it upside down through those watercolored eyes, and she said, "Yes, that is what they say." When Annelle asked what she meant by they, she said, "The ones the swamp takes, I heard her calling me." That is what all of them write, Mr. Trebeck, when they have the presence of mind to write anything at all. Some do not. She said this the way a doctor says a diagnosis they have said too many times. And Ansel Trebeck, who did not believe in swamp witches, felt the cold along the back of his neck begin at the collar and work down through his shoulder blades. He said, "Miss Hollow, are you telling me you called those men?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "No, I have never called anyone. I have spent my life keeping something from calling. Do you understand the difference?" He said he was not sure he did. She said, "My father built this house on this ground because there is a thing in the water under it that does not care to be alone. It has been in the water under this house since before my father built here. Since before there was a parish here to notice. My father did not know that when he chose the ground. He was a young man looking for cypress to cut. He found the ground was solid enough for pilings, and he drove them, and he built, and he brought my mother out here in the spring of 1854, and I was born under this roof. My father found out about the thing in the water too late. That is why he drowned. My mother found out about the thing in the water too late. That is why she walked into it. I found out near the end, when my mother could not sleep anymore for the sound of it under the boards, and she told me what it was, and she told me what had to be done to keep it quiet. And then the next Sunday morning she walked out, because she could not stand to do it anymore. And I have been the door between it and this parish ever since. When it is quiet, no one goes missing. When it is not quiet, men go missing. It is not quiet now. And she said, "Beck, if you had any sense at all, you would put your skiff in the water and pull back to Little Cayenne and get on the next train to New Orleans and never speak the name of this parish again for the rest of your natural life." Ansel Trebeck did not know what to say to that. He was a man of ledgers. Ledgers do not have a column for things in the water. If that is true, why do you not leave? She smiled again, the small smile, and said, "Mr. Trebeck, if I leave, there is no door. If there is no door, then it does not come in the shape of a voice. It comes in the shape it wants. And if that happens, this parish will not be the only parish that empties." He asked her what he could do to help. She said nothing, he said. "There must be something." She said, "Mr. Beck, you can go back to town and you can tell the firm that Oza's Doubtfire cannot be produced, and you can pay his widow, because his widow has done nothing wrong and needs her money. That is what you can do." And then he stood up and she stood up, and she walked him to the ladder. And as he swung his boot over onto the top rung, she said his first name for the first time. "Ansel." He looked back. She said, "Do not open the shutters tonight. Whatever you hear at your window, do not open the shutters." He sat in the skiff at the base of her ladder for perhaps a minute before he took up the pole. He looked at the water. The water did not look back. But he had the strong and unshakable feeling, sitting there, that something was watching him from directly below the boat, and that if he leaned over the side and put his face near the surface, it would show him a face not his own. He did not lean over the side. He pulled back the 2 miles to Little Cayenne with the sun low on his right side and the moss brushing against his hat at every third stroke. He got to the landing at dusk. He walked to the boarding house. He ate a plate of red beans and rice he did not taste. He went up to his room. He locked the door. He shut the shutters. He turned the lamp low. He sat on the edge of the bed with his coat still on and his boots still laced. And at about 9 in the evening, by the wind-up clock on the little table, something began to knock at the shutter. It was a small, polite knock. 2 taps. A pause. 2 taps. The way a person knocks at a door in a town where knocking is the polite thing to do. His window was on the 2nd floor. There was nothing to stand on outside it. Nothing at all. Ansel Trebeck sat very still on the edge of the bed and listened. The knocking went on for perhaps 10 minutes. Then a voice said through the shutter in a tone he recognized because he had heard it that afternoon across a table with tea in a tin cup, "Ansel, Ansel, open the shutter." It was not her voice. It was almost her voice. Something about the vowels was wrong. It was her voice the way a good drawing of a person's face is that person's face, everything in the right place, and still no one you would kiss on the mouth. Ansel Trebeck did not open the shutter. He sat with his hands flat on his knees for a long time. After a while the voice stopped. After another while the knocking stopped. And then, and this is the part he wrote down the next morning and underlined in his notebook, then something took a slow, deep breath outside his window, a breath like a large animal at the end of a long day. It was very close to the shutter, so close he could feel the wood cool against his own face from 3 feet away, as if the breath had drawn heat out of the room and out of him and out of the wall between them. He did not move, he did not breathe himself. He counted to 60 in his head, the way a man does when he is trying to keep from doing something foolish, and when he reached 60, he started again at 1. He got to 60 a second time, he got to about 40 on the third, and then it went away. It went away by moving down the wall. He heard the scrape of it going down. It took the time a big man takes to descend a flight of stairs, and it made the same rhythm of pauses, as if it were considering whether to come back up. And then the yard below the window was quiet. He did not sleep. He sat with his hands on his knees and watched the shutter until the crack of it began to show the first gray of morning. And in the morning he opened the shutter because it was daylight, and he was a man of ledgers. There were no marks on the shutter. There was nothing in the yard. There was a print in the mud below his window that he chose not to describe in the report. It was not a shoe. It was not a boot. It was not the print of any animal he could name, and he had grown up on a farm in western Kentucky and had known most of what an animal print looked like. It was long, longer than a man's forearm, and the pattern of it, if pattern was even the right word, was not the pattern of anything that walked upright, and not the pattern of anything that walked on all fours either. And Ansel Trebeck stood over it a long time in the wet morning, without any thought that would form into a sentence. Then he covered it with the toe of his boot, scraping the mud back until the print was gone. He did not know why he did that. He would think about it later. When he came downstairs, the boarding house was full of quiet. The landlady, a stout woman named Idalia Beaumont, was sitting at the kitchen table crying without making a sound. Ansel asked her what was wrong. Idalia Beaumont said, without looking up, "Cyprian is gone." Ansel said, "Gone how?" Idalia said, "His skiff came in at the landing this morning with his pole in it and his coat folded on the seat. My sister sent for him last night to walk her home from the store, and he never got there. And someone said they saw him at the landing at 11 at night, pulling out west and calling out." And here she stopped because she did not want to say the rest of it. Ansel said, "Calling out what, Idalia?" And she said, "Calling out that he had heard her calling him." Ansel Trebeck went upstairs and packed his bag. He wrote a wire for Baton Rouge and a wire for New Orleans and a wire for the firm, and he walked to the small telegraph office and sent them. In each of the wires he wrote different words, but in each of them the meaning was the same. He was going back into the West Run. He did not intend to leave anyone else where he had left Cyprian. He went to the constable's office. He told Renard Boaz everything about the pail, about the note, about Margaret Hollow at her table, about the knock on the shutter, about the voice, about the breath, about the print in the mud. He did not embellish, he did not editorialize. He was an insurance man. He described what he had seen the way an insurance man describes damage. When he was done, Renard Boaz was quiet a long time. He sat at his desk with his big hands on his knees. He looked at the wall. Then he said, "Mr. Trebeck, there is a thing I did not tell you the day you came in." And Ansel said, "Tell me now." And Boaz said, "My older brother went missing in the year 1897 on the West Run. He was 28 years old. He was strong on the water. He went missing the same way. His coat was folded, and there was a note in his pail that said, 'I heard her calling me.'" Boaz said, "I have hated Margaret Hollow for 15 years, Mr. Trebeck, and I have never once been able to prove she did a thing. So I am going with you today, and whatever we find at that stilt house, you are going to let me handle. Do you understand me?" Ansel said he did. They took the constable's flat-bottomed launch, which had a small kicker motor that Renard Boaz did not turn on until they were half a mile out of Little Cayenne, because he said the West Run did not like an engine, and he did not want to put it in a bad mood any earlier than he had to. They went under the moss with the little motor coughing. The water was blacker than the day before. Ansel Trebeck had not thought that was possible. The cypress knees looked larger, or more of them, or more awake. He could not have said what the difference was, only that the difference was there. And halfway to the third bend, they passed a place where the water was so still it looked poured. And Ansel Trebeck saw, or thought he saw, or later would tell himself he had imagined, a face just under the surface, not a body, a face, turned up, eyes open, watching. He did not point it out. He told himself he had imagined it. And 100 yards past the still place, the constable cut the motor and said, "Do you hear that?" Ansel listened, and what he heard was Cyprian Rowe from somewhere far off in the trees calling his name. The voice said, Mister, help me. Mister, I am over here." And it was Cyprian's voice. It was exactly Cyprian's voice, down to the way the boy dropped the R at the end of a word. And Ansel Trebeck almost stood up in the boat. He almost called back. The constable's big hand closed on his shoulder and pushed him back down onto the seat. Renard Boaz put a finger to his lips. He shook his head very slowly. He mouthed the word, "No." They sat in the boat. The voice called again from a different direction, then from a third direction, then terribly from directly under the boat in a wet little whisper, right against the boards. And Ansel Trebeck felt the wood under his boots go cold. Renard Boaz started the motor. He turned the boat. He took them the rest of the way to the third bend at a speed that was probably not safe. The launch skidded on the surface of the water and hit a low root that would have stopped them cold if the constable had not lifted the kicker in time. Ansel Trebeck held on to the seat with both hands. Behind them, the voices multiplied. He heard Oza's Doubtfire, whose voice he had never heard in life, calling for his widow by name. He heard Delphine Voro naming a debt he still owed. He heard Reno Sykes singing something without any words that was somehow worse than any of the words. And around the third bend and up to the ladder of Margaret Hollow's house. And when they tied the launch, the whole swamp behind them was calling in the voices of every man who had ever gone missing on the West Run. It was calling in the voices of men from long before Ansel Trebeck was born. Margaret Hollow was standing at the top of the ladder in the same gray dress. She looked at Renard Boaz. She said, "Renard." Boaz said, "Margaret." She said, "You should not have brought him." Boaz said, "I know it." She said, "Come up." They came up. Inside the long, clean room, the stove was burning higher than it had been the day before. There were 3 lamps lit, even though it was full morning. The bundles of herbs were shaking a little on their strings, though no window was open and no breath of wind was moving in the house. She sat them at the table. She did not offer tea. She said, "It is under the boards. It has been under the boards since noon yesterday." "It is angry because I would not tell it your name yesterday, Mr. Trebeck. It is angry because I did not open the door I keep. It wants a name to answer to. If I give it a name, it will take that person, and it will be quiet another 8 years. If I do not give it a name, it will come up through the floor tonight and take every soul in Little Cayenne by morning." She said, "That is the choice." She had said it in the tone of a woman reciting weather. Renard Boaz said, "Margaret." She said, "Renard." He said, "My brother." In 97 she said, "Yes." He said, "Was that you?" She looked at him a very long time. Then she said, "No, but I chose not to speak the name that would have kept him." I chose to stay silent that year because the man I would have had to name was a man I had loved once, 40 years before, when I was still young enough to think anyone in this parish would marry a Hollow. And I was not strong enough. Renard, your brother went instead. And I have been paying for that choice for 15 years, and I will pay for it until the day I close my eyes for the last time. Renard Boaz put his face in his hands. He did not cry. He sat like that a long minute. Then he stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the water. Margaret Hollow looked at Ansel Trebeck. She said, "Mr. Trebeck, there is a way through tonight. It is not a pleasant way, but it is a way." And Ansel Trebeck, who was a man of ledgers who had come south to verify a body for a widow, said the 4 words that would follow him the rest of his life. "What do you need?" she said. "I need you to sit in that rocker. I need you to stay in that rocker until sunrise, no matter what you hear. I need you to keep your eyes on this." And she took from the shelf a small clay bowl and set it on the table. In the bowl was a plain river stone, dark, about the size of a hen's egg. She said, "This is the door. This is what my father made when he built this house. This is what I have kept for 43 years. It has to be watched by a person who has never lied to it. That is the only rule." I cannot watch it because I have lied to it once. Renard cannot watch it because he has hated me for 15 years and would break it the first hour if he had the chance. You have not been here long enough to lie to it, Mr. Trebeck. So you will watch it, and Renard and I will go down into the water tonight. Because the water is where the argument is, and the argument must be had by someone, and we will come back before sunrise or we will not. He asked her what would happen if he looked away. She said, "It will speak in a voice you know. It will call you by the name your mother gave you. It will ask you a question you have wanted the answer to for 30 years. It will show you the face of a person you have wanted to see for as long, and if you look up from the stone, Mr. Trebeck, even once it will come through the stone, and there will be no door after that. Do you understand?" He said he understood. She said, "Good. Then eat something. It is a long night." Ansel Trebeck did not remember eating. He remembered sitting in the rocker. He remembered the door closing behind Margaret Hollow and Renard Boaz, and the wet, slow sound of their boots on the ladder going down, and the small, distant push of the launch as it left the pilings and moved out into the west run. He remembered the small clay bowl on the table in the yellow lamplight, and the plain dark stone in it, and how it did not look like anything at all. And he remembered the swamp starting up its calling again, only closer this time. He remembered hearing his own mother's voice, dead 19 years, at the window. He remembered hearing his own name in the voice of a woman he had loved and lost in the summer of 1893, whose name he had not spoken aloud since the day of her funeral. He remembered the shutters rattling. He remembered a wet, slow scrape coming up the ladder outside, the exact same sound the constable's boots had made going down, but heavier and heavier again. He remembered his hands going white on the arms of the rocker. He remembered the door to the cabin, which had been latched, beginning to rattle gently, as if someone on the other side were leaning against it with the flat of a hand and thinking. He remembered a woman's voice say quietly, right at the crack of the door, "Ansel, it is not too much to ask. Only look at me. Look at my face. It has been so long." And Ansel Trebeck, who had loved a woman named Charity Verlin when he was 24 and had buried her at 25 with a wedding still not paid off, felt every muscle in his neck lock against the pull of looking up. He kept his eyes on the stone. The stone did nothing. Nothing at all. It sat in the little clay bowl like any river stone you would pick up on a walk. He remembered the door rattled harder. He remembered a second voice joined it, low and male, that he did not recognize, and a third that was the voice of his own father, who had died in the winter of 1889. He remembered he did not look away. He remembered the stone in the bowl, beginning at about 2 in the morning to hum faintly, a low note like a finger drawn around the rim of a wet glass. He remembered he did not look away. He remembered the humming rose. It rose the way a tuning fork rises when a string finds it. It rose until the tin cup on the table began to vibrate against the wood. It rose until the herbs on their strings above him began to sway in slow arcs, as if a hand had brushed each of them and set them going. And then it stopped, all of it, the humming, the voices, the rattling at the door, the scrape at the ladder. He remembered the shutters stopped. He remembered a very long time in which nothing happened at all, which was somehow worse than what had come before it, because in the nothing he had to listen to his own breathing, and his own breathing was the only sound in the world. He remembered nothing came in, and at some point near dawn, he must have fallen asleep in the rocker with his eyes still on the stone because he woke to gray light and the sound of a door. Renard Boaz came in first. He was wet to the collarbone. His hair was flat against his skull. His face was gray. He was carrying his hat in his hand, which was strange because he had worn it low the whole way in. He looked at Ansel Trebeck. He looked at the stone in the bowl, which was quiet again, and looked once more like nothing more than a stone. He said, "She is not coming back." Ansel Trebeck said, "What happened?" Renard Boaz said, "She went into the water and she told it a name." And Ansel said, "Whose name?" And Renard Boaz sat down in the other chair and he said, "Her own. She told it her own name, Mr. Trebeck. She said, 'I am Margaret Hollow and I am the door, and take me and be quiet another 100 years.' And she said it 3 times. And the water went still, and it took her, and it did not surface again. That is what happened." Ansel Trebeck did not say anything. He looked at the stone. The stone looked like a stone. Renard Boaz stood up after a while and walked to the shelf and took down the bowl. He carried it to the stove. He opened the stove door. He set the bowl inside on the coals. He closed the door and stood there a full minute with his big flat hand on the stove door. Neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the sky was turning the color of old brass, and the water below the pilings was moving again. Small, ordinary ripples, small, ordinary sounds. The swamp, remembering how to be a swamp. A bird called from the far side of the run, then another. Then he took his hand away from the stove door and turned and said, "We should go." They pulled back to Little Cayenne in the constable's launch with the motor off, because there was no need for it. The swamp on the way back was quiet. There were birds. Ansel Trebeck heard a reed-winged blackbird at the second bend and almost wept, which was not a thing he did. When they reached the landing, the town was already coming out to meet them, because word had gotten around in the way word gets around in a town of 200 that had lain awake all night listening. Idalia Beaumont was at the front of the crowd. Ansel Trebeck did not know what he was going to tell her. And then from the far side of the landing, out of the reeds where the water met the boards, Cyprian Rowe walked. His clothes were soaked through. His face was blank. He did not remember anything from the moment he had tied his skiff at 11 the night before to the moment he had woken up in the mud at the edge of the run at dawn. He was very cold and very hungry. There was a small cut on the palm of his right hand that he did not know how he had gotten, but he was whole, he was alive. Idalia Beaumont dropped to her knees on the boards of the landing. Cyprian said, "Mr. Trebeck." And Ansel Trebeck went to him and put his own coat around him, because Cyprian's own coat had been folded on the seat of a skiff, and neither of them mentioned that Oz's Doubtfire's widow was paid. Delphine Vorot's widow was paid on a policy Beck was not obligated to open but opened anyway. Renaud Sykes had no widow, but he had a sister in New Orleans, and Trebeck saw to it that the small sum owing to the estate went to her without a fight. He walked the checks up the front stairs of each of their houses himself, hat in hand, and he answered every question they had. And to none of them did he say the words, "Margaret Hollow," not once. The firm accepted Ansel Trebeck's report, which described the case as death by misadventure in the Louisiana Bayou, with bodies unrecoverable due to the nature of the terrain, and which did not mention Margaret Hollow at all. His supervisor, a man named Ovid Prather, read the report and looked at Ansel Trebeck across a desk in New Orleans and asked him only one question: "Is there anything in that parish that will come back on us?" And Ansel Trebeck said, "No, Mr. Prather. Nothing in that parish will come back on anyone ever again." And Ovid Prather signed the report and slid it into the file cabinet, and it stayed there for 30 years until the cabinet was emptied. And the file was sent to the archive without a single soul reading it a second time. Renard Boaz remained the constable of Little Cayenne until 1928, when a stroke put him in a chair by a window for the last 2 years of his life. He never married. He never took a boat past the third bend of the West Run again. He would sit at that window and watch the water and drink chicory coffee. And once near the end, a young deputy who had come by to check on him asked what he was looking at out there so long every day, and the old constable said only, "I am seeing if she comes back." And the deputy asked, "If who comes back?" And Renard Boaz did not answer. And the deputy did not ask a second time, because there was something in the way the old constable was looking at the water that the deputy did not want to be part of. The house on stilts stood empty. In 1921, a hurricane took the roof and the walls after, and the pilings finally in 1936, and by the time the war came, the stilts had gone back into the water without a trace. But the men in Little Cayenne noticed something and passed it down quietly from father to son, without ever writing it in any register. Every 8 years from 1912 on, the pattern that should have started up again did not. No men went missing on the West Run. Not in 1920, not in 1928, not in 1936, not in 1944, not in 1952. It has been quiet a very long time. It has been quiet exactly as long as she said it would be. Ansel Trebeck went back to New Orleans. He worked at the firm another 11 years. He never took another case in a parish with standing water. He wrote a private account of what had happened in the autumn of 1912, and he sealed it, and it went to his son at his death in 1941. and his son gave it in the 1960s to a small university library that kept boxes like it. And that is how I know the story I am telling you tonight. On the last page of the account, in his careful ink-stained handwriting, Ansel Trebeck wrote something I want to leave you with. He wrote, "I do not know what Margaret Hollow was. I have thought about it every day of my life since. I have thought she was a witch. I have thought she was a saint. I have thought she was a woman doing a job no one asked her to do, and no one thanked her for, and no one relieved her of. And I have thought that is probably the truest thing I can say about her. But every once in a while, on a still night with the window open, I think about the stone in the fire, and I think she said it would be quiet 100 years. I wonder what happens on the 101st. And I wonder that too, because if her clock started in 1912, then the 100 years came and went a long while ago, and the maps in the parish office do not show Blackrush anymore, and the West Run has silted up so bad you cannot get a skiff past the first bend, and nobody has looked for anything under those pilings in a very long time. Little Cayenne itself is barely a place now. 24 houses, a gas station that closes at 6, a post office that opens 3 days a week, last I checked, and I checked because I wanted to know. The parish courthouse is still standing, but the register that Ansel Trebeck sat with for 6 hours in 1912 went into a fire in 1948, and no copy was ever made, so there is no register to count from anymore. Nobody is keeping the 8-year clock. Maybe she bought more than she said. Maybe she bought forever. I hope she did, but I do not think she did. I think 100 years is a long time to a person and a very short time to whatever was under those boards, and I think somewhere out in what used to be the West Run, in water that no boat visits and no map records, the pattern is due. And if you would like to sit with more cases like this one, 10 of them, told all the way through in a voice made for the dark. What the mountain keeps is the collection. The link is in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. And tell me in the comments, do you think Margaret Hollow was a witch, or do you think she was the only thing standing between that parish and something a great deal worse? I want to know. Stay with me for the next account. Turn the lamp.